Your baby's gone, Grace. So why's that cradle still rockin'?" The words weren't spoken out loud. They floated in her head in the first gray breath of morning. Grace Whitlock stood barefoot on the warped floorboards, fingers white on the edge of the empty cradle, watching it sway the way it had on the night he died. The room was cold enough to bite, but sweat clung to her neck, and the front of her nightdress was damp with milk, her body stubbornly made. Her breasts ached with a heavy, punishing pull. Every dawn it was the same. She woke to a cry that wasn't there, heart racing, hands fumbling for the baby she no longer had. The sound lived in her bones now, an echo that refused to fade. She pressed her thumb into the groove on the cradle's rail where her husband had carved a tiny star before the fever took him too. And for a moment, she hated both of them for leaving her behind on this scrap of earth. Outside, the high plains lay hushed under a veil of frost. The chicken coop creaked. Somewhere, a cow lowed. But inside the one-room house, the loudest thing was the silence pressing in on Grace, thick as funeral cloth. Folks in town said the Whitlock place had gone haunted. They said any woman who kept boiling water for a baby already buried was touched in the head, maybe cursed. Grace heard their whispers whenever she rode into town for flour or lamp oil. Poor Grace. Poor crazy widow. Can't let go. Won't let go. She kept her chin high, shoulders straight, eyes like shuttered windows. But the words clung to her on the ride home, crawled under her skin and into the hours. After midnight, when the wind scraped at the shutters and the phantom crying started up again. She shifted, feeling another hot leak of milk. Her body still believed there was a child to feed. Her body refused to learn what her heart wouldn't name. She pressed the heel of her hand against her breast, jaw clenched. "He's gone," she whispered into the stillness, as if repetition could teach her flesh what her mind kept circling and never landing on. "He's gone, he's gone, he's gone." The cradle answered with a lonely creak. She remembered the way they had laid him in the ground on the hill beyond the cottonwoods, the preacher's words thin and useless against the wind. She remembered dirt hitting the wooden box, each clod a brutal drumbeat. The world should have split open that day, but instead the sun kept shining and the same women went right back to their chores. Like many of us, she carried scars no one could see. Out here, grief was something you were expected to swallow with your coffee and keep moving, like a rock in your boot you never dared to remove. But hers had grown too sharp, cutting her from the inside. The phantom cry rose again, distant, threading through the room like smoke. Grace stiffened. "Stop it," she hissed, not sure if she meant her mind or God or the memory itself. She forced herself to look straight into the cradle, half expecting to see his blanket, his tiny fist reaching for her. There was nothing, only shadows, and the dent in the mattress where his body had once warmed the cotton. The sound came again. This time it wasn't inside her head. It was outside, carried on the cold morning air. A baby's cry, faint but real, drifting in from beyond the cottonwoods. The earth was stiff with frost when Grace stepped outside, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The cry was still echoing, thin and wavering like wind through a broken window. She held the lantern out in front of her. Its flame flickered and stretched in the pale dawn. Her breath came out in puffs as she followed the sound across the yard and past the cottonwoods, boots pressing soft indentations in the frosted grass. "If this is a dream," she murmured, "Lord, let me wake." The cry came again, a rasping, gasping wail, echoing from the canyon beyond the old grazing trail. Her heart hammered. Part of her, half grief, half hope, told her it was him, her baby, reaching out to her from somewhere, beyond the thin curtain of death. She nearly stumbled, Lantern swinging wildly. Another cry. Thinner this time. Not just one. Two. The canyon swallowed her as she descended, cold scraping her cheeks raw. Rock shifted under her boots. Lantern light washed across jagged edges and dead brush. She sucked in a breath, listening. There. She moved faster, nearly jogging, the shawl whipping behind her. Her fingers tightened around the lantern so hard they shook. Her milk ached again. Full. Urgent. The sound, it couldn't be imagined. No phantom had lungs like that. When she rounded a bend, the world went still. Beneath a bent, dying elm tree, wrapped in tattered cloth, lay two newborn babies. Twins. A boy and a girl. The boy cried louder, red-faced, fist balled. The girl, she barely made a sound. Her lips were bluish, breath ragged, chest rising too slowly. Grace dropped to her knees, lantern clattering beside her. "Oh, God!" Her hands trembled as she touched the girl first. Cold, too cold. The boy's cries rattled the canyon walls. A sharp, insistent plea for survival. "Who would leave you here?" Grace whispered. Her voice cracked. She pressed her hand to the girl's tiny chest. The faintest heartbeat. Instinct took over. She pulled both infants into her shawl, tucking them against her chest, feeling their impossible weight. So small, so profoundly alive. Her milk let down with a painful rush. Tears filled her eyes. "No," she muttered. "No, this can't be happening." She looked up, lantern flickering against the bend of the canyon. Above the children, etched into the bark of the elm, was a crude symbol, a crooked X with a line running through it. She stared at it, pulse roaring in her ears. That wasn't God's mark. That was a warning. Or a curse. The air seemed colder as she stood, babies clutched to her body, shawl wrapped tightly around them. She started back toward the homestead, legs stiff, emotions tangled. Fear, hope, confusion. Her heart screamed with the weight of a choice she hadn't made, but already felt bound to. By the time her house appeared through the trees, the boy's cries had softened, but the girl's breathing had gone dangerously shallow. Grace pressed her lips to both of their heads. "No mother leaves twins to die unless evil is in the air," she whispered. When she stepped back onto her porch, lantern dimming, the wind shifted, and the empty cradle inside her house began to rock on its own. Grace's body didn't ask for permission. It simply remembered. The weaker twin, the little girl with the gray-blue lips, whimpered as Grace cradled her beside the hearth. The cabin was warm now, fire crackling, smoke curling up through the chimney. Grace had wrapped both babies in soft blankets she hadn't dared pack away since the funeral. She sat on the floorboards, back against the wall, nightdress loose, heart pounding like a runaway horse. The boy had finally quieted, suckling the corner of the blanket in his sleep. But the girl wasn't doing well. Her breaths came thin and cold, barely lifting her tiny chest. Grace could feel her own milk rising, almost painful. It was as if her body had woken from a nightmare into a miracle, that ancient maternal instinct flushing through her, unstoppable. She unbuttoned her gown, chest rising with each trembling breath. "Come on, little one." The baby's mouth found her, and Grace gasped, head thudding against the log wall. A deep sob rippled through her. She hadn't felt this in weeks, not since her own son's cries had stopped. The pressure, the warmth, the science of it didn't matter. It was a spiritual thing, a sacred thing. Her breaths released in a rush, milk flowing like something relieved to be useful again. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her skin. Her breathing steadied. Grace felt her body exhale. Finally, as if it had been bracing for heartbreak and now clung to the possibility of redemption. I remember, Grace whispered, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks. My body remembers you. All of you. She held the baby close, watching the boy sleep in the cradle by the fire. Her cradle, her blanket, her milk. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine that she was not a widow, not a mother whose arms had gone empty. The cabin no longer felt haunted. It felt full. Outside, the world didn't understand, had never understood. By midday, the first whisper had already reached town. Widow Whitlock had found babies on her land. Or she'd stolen them. Or she'd conjured them from the grave. Folks were convinced the dead clung to her like fog. That's what happens when a woman drinks her grief and keeps standing. Grace felt those whispers pushing at the edges of her mind while she sat feeding the boy, his small mouth opening and closing, eyes half-lidded with trust. She pressed her cheek to his head, inhaling the warm, milk-sweet scent. She knew what it meant to love something gone, to keep feeding memory because the body refused to let go. The twin she held now, she wasn't a replacement. She was a second chance, maybe even salvation, or maybe a curse. She rocked back, watching both babies breathe, and let herself feel the mess of emotions. Joy tangled with terror, grief blooming into tenderness. A knock thundered on her front door. Grace stiffened, babies pressed to her chest. She rose slowly, heart once again thudding. As she reached for the shotgun by the hearth, she glanced out the window. 3 riders, townsfolk, and at their head Mrs. Whitaker, the preacher's wife, wearing a frown carved from stone. Grace adjusted her shawl, opened the door. "What's brought you all the way out here?" she asked, voice calm as cold water. "We heard tell you're keeping children that ain't yours," Mrs. Whitaker said, "and that you're feeding them from your body. That ain't natural." Grace's eyes didn't blink. "Babies crying in the canyon ain't natural either." She raised her chin. "But leaving them to die is wicked. That I won't do." Mrs. Whitaker looked her up and down, disapproval dripping like pitch. "Some say your grief's made you mad. Some say you're cursed." Grace smiled, small and sharp. "Some say a lot of things. Words don't keep children alive. Milk does." The townsfolk stared at her, muttering, unsure whether to cross themselves or run. Grace didn't flinch until they rode off. Hours later, as the sun dipped low, she sat beside the babies again. Her hands brushed the wood of the cradle. The room was quiet, but she felt a presence. Her son, perhaps, watching, proving. "What if they're all right?" she murmured. The fire popped, and one of the twins stirred, cooing. Grace ran a finger down the girl's cheek. She didn't know which scared her more, them or keeping them. The sound of hooves on frostbitten earth split the quiet mid-morning air. Grace felt it before she heard it, a shift in her gut, a warning tremor. She set the twins gently in the cradle and stood, wiping her palms against her skirt. Through the window, she watched a lone rider cutting across her land, a dark shape against the pale winter grass. His coat whipped like a shadow behind him. He dismounted without a word. He was taller than most men she'd seen, shoulders broad beneath a worn black duster and hat pulled low. His face had the kind of lines cut into it by survival and sin. He walked like a man who expected no resistance and feared no consequence. When he reached her porch, he didn't knock. "You Grace Whitlock?" His voice was rough as gravel. Grace stepped outside, shotgun in hand, but not raised. "That depends on who's asking." He smirked. "Name's Cole Burnside. I'm here for what's mine." Grace stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." He took off his hat and stepped closer, leaning against a porch beam like he owned it. His eyes were sharp, blue like winter river ice. Two babes, crying by a canyon tree. Wrapped in cloth, my woman stitched herself. I got a good memory and a bad temper. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. So you did leave them. His jaw flexed. Would have never. My woman died giving birth. My men betrayed me. Stole what they knew mattered. I've been hunting those kids for 3 days. Grace thought of the crude marking carved into the elm. A sign. Maybe meant for him. Maybe meant for her. And you found them, Cole continued, pointing toward the window. Alive. Sure looks like fate wants them in their father's arms. There was no sign of you, she said, voice barely above a breath. Just 2 dying babies and a night colder than hell. Cole's smirk faltered. It wasn't thanks that filled his eyes. It was expectation, entitlement. You've held him long enough. I'll take them now. Grace stepped forward, blocking his path. The girl barely breathes. They need care. He arched a brow. And I don't. I've ridden half a state living on beans and grit. This isn't about beans, she snapped. It's about letting them heal, grow, live. For a long moment, the air tightened between them. His gaze slid over her face, resting on her breasts, still full after feeding. His smirk returned, darker this time. Ain't no room for dead babies and stolen lives in this world. Her throat closed like a fist. That humiliation, sharp and sudden, it cut clean through her. You talk big, she whispered, voice trembling with rage. But you weren't here when they cried. He stepped back, eyes narrowing. I'll give you till sundown, and I'm coming for what's mine, with or without your blessing. Grace didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him turn, saddle his horse, and ride away, leaving a cold silence behind, one heavier than before. Inside, the twins began to cry again. Grace closed her eyes, jaw tight. Sundown wasn't very far. The decision wasn't just about right or wrong, it was about survival. For them, and maybe for her too. Grace stood in the center of the cabin as the morning melted into afternoon. Shadows crept across the floorboards. The twins slept, full bellies, soft breaths, but Grace's heart beat double time, louder than any clock. She paced in tight circles, hands flexing and unfurling. She hadn't fought a soul in her life, not even the women who whispered behind her back, not even death when it stole her son from her arms. But now death had sent a messenger, a man in black with gunpowder in his veins, arrogance in his eyes. Her body remembered what grief felt like, the hollow ache, the breathless panic, but it also remembered something else. It remembered the quiet strength of her husband, Eli, the way he'd hunt at dawn and ride back with meat over his shoulder and dust in his beard, saying, "Sometimes you kill to live. Sometimes you love to kill." She'd hated that saying. Now she felt it curling inside her chest like truth. Her gaze landed on his rifle, still mounted above the hearth. She hadn't touched it since the day he died, but something in her bones stirred. She dragged a chair beneath it, lifted it down. The wood felt foreign and familiar. She checked the chamber. 2 rounds. 2 rounds would never stop a man like Cole Burnside. Not if he brought company. But that wasn't the point. It was her land, her babies, her chance to be someone more than a ghost. Grace set the rifle on the table, took a breath, and began preparing her home, not like a wife, but like a soldier. She closed the shutters and dragged the crib into the corner, where the wall was thickest. She moved the rocking chair near the door. She lit a single lantern and tucked it behind a jug of water so the light wouldn't spill through the cracks. Then she walked outside. The sun was sinking low when she hammered a nail into the porch beam, hanging a strip of white cloth, torn from her own nightdress. A signal, not of surrender, of warning. Grace stepped back, chest rising with a shaky breath. The world seemed quieter. Even the wind paused at the edges of her property. When she stepped inside again, she paused by the cradle. The twins lay curled like question marks, breath fogging the air. She knelt beside them. "I wasn't brave before," she whispered. "Not for my son. I cried while they buried him. I let myself break." Her voice cracked. Tears gathered, but she didn't let them fall. "These babies. You woke something up in me. Something fierce." Her hands hovered over their cheeks. "If I fail you, it won't be for lack of trying. I promise that." She rose and took her place by the window. The world outside was orange and red, dust rising in the dying light. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Even if folks thought her strange, broken, cursed, she had something they didn't. She was still standing. She pressed her palm to the window pane. Her voice softened to a murmur, meant for the twins, but loud enough for her ancestors to hear. "If you've ever loved something fragile, if you've ever stood alone against the dark, ride with us in true Western stories where every tale finds its voice." Outside, the first star began to glow. The sky grew darker. Grace lifted the rifle. She wasn't sure if she was scared or becoming dangerous. The sun vanished. The night took a breath. And somewhere close, too close, someone stepped on a dry branch. Thunder cracked like the sky itself was splitting in two. The storm had rolled in fast, dragging a black curtain across the land just after nightfall. Rain hadn't come yet, but the wind was wild, rattling loose boards and shaking the trees. A lightning flash illuminated the cabin for a heartbeat. Grace's face pale, jaw clenched, rifle steady in her hands. The twins slept, bundled safe beside the hearth where dry wood crackled. Grace moved like a ghost through the dim room, her breath shallow but measured. She'd been standing watch for hours. Then she felt it. Footsteps, slow, intentional, coming up the porch. She clicked the rifle safety off. A fist hit the door. "Grace Whitlock," Cole Burnside's voice cut through the wind. "Open that damn door and hand 'em over." Grace didn't move. Instead, she called back, voice strong through the storm. "God's watching this cabin, Cole, and so are the dead." Silence, then laughter. Cruel, amused. "Lady, God ain't looking out here. Only bullets and blood decide things now." A crash wood splintered. The door swung inward, ripped from its hinge. Cole stepped inside, water dripping from his black duster, eyes sharp with the promise of violence. Beside him were two more men, scrawny, mean-smiled, rifles drawn. Grace raised the gun, hands steady. "One more step and I put a hole where your heart ought to be." Cole chuckled. "You aim that thing like you know how to use it." "I do now." For a heartbeat, all three men paused. Wind screamed through the broken doorway. A single log popped in the fire. Then one of the outlaws lunged. The rifle fired, loud, deafening. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder, cursing. Grace didn't lower the gun. She pivoted, ready for the next shot, but she wasn't fast enough. Cole raised his pistol, aimed at her. God help her. She squeezed her eyes shut. Another shot cracked the air, but not from her. Cole jerked, stumbled back, blood blooming against his shirt. Grace spun, eyes searching. A figure stood in the doorway, rain sluicing off his hat, rifle smoking. Sheriff Amos. The same sheriff who'd called her mad when she asked for protection. Only now his eyes were lit with something fierce. Not pity, conviction. "Get out of this house," he growled at the remaining outlaw, "or I'll let her finish the job." The man bolted into the rain, disappearing into the night. Cole, bleeding and furious, staggered toward the sheriff. Grace aimed again. "Don't make me do it," she warned. Cole smirked. Even wounded, he was a flame that refused to die. "You've set a fire, Grace Whitlock," he rasped. "One you can't put out." Then he ran, out the door, into the storm. The sheriff let him go, then turned back, breath ragged. Grace lowered her rifle, hands trembling now that adrenaline had loosened its grip. "You came," she whispered. He nodded once. "Took me a while to listen. That was my sin." A gust shook the cabin. The twins stirred but didn't cry. Grace's knees buckled, and the sheriff caught her. Steady, quiet. "Sometimes you don't stand for yourself," he said softly. "You stand because someone still needs you upright." Grace nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "They do." Sheriff Amos looked toward the empty doorway, a rain blurring the horizon. "What's coming next won't be easy. He'll be back, with more men, maybe worse." Grace straightened, wiped her eyes, then picked up her rifle. "Then I'll be ready," she said. Lightning flashed, and somewhere deep in the night, a wolf howled. Grace didn't sleep. Not after the storm broke, not after the sheriff left with a warning and an apology that tasted like dust on her tongue. He rode off into the dark with the rain dripping off the brim of his hat, leaving her with 2 infants, a half-broken door, and a promise that Cole Burnside would come back with more men. "You can't stay here," the sheriff had said. "There ain't a soul in this valley who will come help if it's you against his kind." Grace knew he was right, but it didn't stop the sting when he said it. Didn't stop the feeling that her home was no longer hers. She sat on the rocking chair all night, rifle in her lap, babies breathing beside her, watchful, haunted. By dawn, she'd made her choice. She stood at the window watching the first light soak the land in gold. The twins were asleep again, clean, fed, swaddled. Grace's chest ached, but not with milk this time, with goodbye. "For you," she whispered to the empty room, "I'll leave everything." She moved through the house slowly, touching things she'd never see again. Her husband's hat hanging on a peg, the rocking chair he'd carved, her wedding shawl, the cradle where she'd held her child as he died. Grief didn't scream anymore. It hummed in her bones. She packed only what she could carry: milk cloths, blankets, 2 small bottles, dried meat. She filled her canteen, strapped Eli's rifle to her back. Then she wrapped the twins close to her chest with strips of fabric, one on each side, tight as her own heartbeat. The sun rose. Grace led the mare from the barn, saddled and waiting. Her hands trembled as she mounted. Her legs shook when they settled into the stirrups. But when she touched the twins, felt their warmth, something inside her locked into place. She rode away without looking back. The prairie stretched like the inside of a memory, wide, endless, unforgiving. Sand and sagebrush blurred beneath her. Wind tugged at her hair, hissed past her ears. She thought of Cole chasing behind her, blood still on his shirt, rage in his eyes. She imagined his men coming across the cabin, finding it empty, finding the cradle gone, finding another mark against his pride. The desert was brutal, but pride could kill faster. Hours passed, the wind grew hotter. Grace's throat tightened with thirst, and still she rode on. She didn't know where she was going, just away, 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 into a future she trusted more than a familiar home poisoned by danger and rumor. As the sun began to set behind the canyon ridges, she slowed the horse and stopped near a stretch of rocks. She slid off, legs nearly buckling. The babies slept, mercifully quiet. Grace sank to her knees beside the horse. For the first time since leaving, she allowed herself to speak. To him. "Eli," she whispered, voice broken, "I'm sorry." She pressed her forehead to the ground. "I couldn't do it for our boy. Couldn't save him. Couldn't stay strong, but they're still breathing, and I think you'd want me to try." The lamb for a long time. Grace unwrapped the twins just enough to check their breathing. She kissed each of their foreheads. "I don't know if I'll survive this," she said softly. "But if I die, they'll die. So I won't." Her voice trembled, but it didn't shatter. She stood again, mounted the mare, and whispered to the child she had lost, "Ride with me, little one. I'm not leaving you. I'm just finally moving forward." She rode into the twilight. Behind her, in the distance, a set of hoofprints began to follow. The sun was a white blade in the sky, cutting mercilessly through the thin clouds and burning the ground beneath it. Grace felt its weight on her spine as she rode. Her mouth had gone dry hours ago. Her hands bled from gripping the reins too tightly. The twins lay pressed against her chest beneath her shawl, warm, small, shifting occasionally with breath and instinct. The first gunshot cracked across the canyon walls like a scream. Her mare reared, and Grace barely kept her seat, kicking hard, urging forward. Another shot followed, closer, sharper. Cole. Her heartbeat surged, matching the rhythm of hooves pounding earth. She glanced back just long enough to see dust rising. 3 riders, spaced apart, chasing like wolves. "God, please." Her voice was barely air. She urged the horse faster, but the canyon narrowed. Stone walls rising high on either side. The heat swam in front of her eyes, sweat blurring her vision. The world shimmered, brown rock fading into white glare, shadows twisting into ghosts whispering, "You can't outrun death." She shook her head, gritted her teeth. Sweat stung her eyes. Her hand slid toward Eli's rifle, but she couldn't fire blind. She needed to survive, not shoot. A man's voice echoed, distorted by stone. "Give 'em up, Grace. Ain't no woman out riding the desert." She clenched her jaw. "I ain't giving you nothing." The horse skidded sharply around a bend. Her legs scraped against jagged rock. She hissed in pain but stayed on, every muscle screaming. Your body can betray you, but a mother's will, that's something else entirely. The canyon floor split ahead, widening into a field of jagged shale. Grace steered hard, leaning forward, praying the horse's legs wouldn't break boom. The second shot clipped stone near her shoulder. Dust exploded. The sound rang in her skull. She couldn't tell where the canyon ended, and her fear began. Her breath turned ragged. She muttered hoarse prayers, half to God, half to the baby she'd buried and still carried somewhere inside her. She thought of the women who'd whispered behind her back, of Mrs. Whitaker's disgust, of the cradle rocking in an empty room. She thought of the endless grief that had wanted her, buried beside her son. "Not today," she gasped. "Not while they're breathing." She glanced down at the twins, faces flushed, mouths working, somehow holding on. Her vision swam, darkness creeping in at the corners. But she kicked the horse again, desperate. The horse stumbled, caught itself, and kept running. Grace cried out, a sound made of rage and love and sheer refusal. "You'll die before I let you take them." Another gunshot rang out, different this time. Shorter, closer. Grace jerked her head up. A flash of movement in the rocks ahead, then another shot. One of the riders behind her screamed, then toppled sideways, falling in a cloud of dust. Grace stared. Was she hallucinating? No. Someone was shooting. For her. The horse crested a ridge, and Grace saw it, dim through the heat wave, a small shape waving from a cabin near the riverbank. A woman. A stranger. But there she stood, rifle raised, eyes dead steady, protecting her, clearing a path. Grace prayed it wasn't a mirage. She rode toward her. Behind her, the canyon echoed with gunfire and curses. She could feel the blood drying under her fingernails. The voices in her head screaming to quit. But she didn't, because pain doesn't matter when purpose outgrows it. And her purpose was 2 tiny heartbeats pressed against her ribs. Grace woke to the faint scent of pine smoke and sagebrush. Something warm rested across her legs. A blanket. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. The room was dim, lit by early morning light leaking in through a thin window. A fire crackled softly across the room. The shingles above her creaked in protest from the cool air. Then she heard it. Soft breathing. The twins! Grace shot upright, panicked until her eyes found them, lying in a cedar-lined basket beside the bed. Bundled in wool blankets, cheeks flushed from sleep, alive. Alive. Her body sagged with the weight of relief. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her ribs where fear still lingered like a bruise. Then she saw her. A woman sat by the fire, hair streaked with gray, face tired but kind. She looked up from stirring a pot and smiled, small but real. "You're awake," she said. "Good. I was starting to think you owed death more than you owed the living." Grace blinked hard. "Where am I?" "My home." The woman stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and walked toward her with a limp visible in her right leg. "Name's Abigail Shaw. Folks around here call me Widow Doc. You can thank me once you can stand steady." Grace's lips trembled. "The babies. They're fine. You weren't." Abigail's eyes softened. "You passed out at the river crossing." Horse came trotting in with 3 lives hanging on by threads. I saw that thread and grabbed it. Grace tried to speak, but the words died. She covered her face with her hands, and the tears came, quiet at first, and unstoppable. Weeks, months, maybe years of grief and strength and horror and hope burst through her in wave after wave. Abigail's hand settled on her shoulder, heavy and grounding. "I know that cry," she whispered. "You hold on so long, you start to believe you don't need to feel anything." She paused. "Then someone reminds you you're human." Grace wiped her eyes, managed to look up. You've lost someone too?" Abigail's jaw tightened. "My boy. 3 winters back. Died with a fever I couldn't treat. World kept moving. I stayed still. Thought I'd be stoned forever." She looked toward the twins. "Then I heard your horse?" Silence settled like a blanket. Not heavy. Not cold. Just honest. Grace reached toward the basket, fingers trembling as she touched the baby girl's cheek. "They need names," she said quietly. "Can't keep calling them boy and girl. Not after all this." Abigail nodded. "What would you call them?" Grace breathed in slowly, voice steady for the first time in a long while. "Gabriel," she said, fingers brushing the boy, "because an angel carried him out of death." Her hand moved to the girl. "And Mercy, because someone, somehow, chose to give it." Abigail bowed her head, voice thick with something like prayer. "Good names." Grace leaned back, exhaustion loosening her body at last. She watched the twins sleep for a long time, letting the quiet settle her bones. She wasn't alone. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't broken. She was rebuilding with help she didn't expect. For the first time since her son died, she whispered thanks to God, to the earth, to the stranger who'd become her shelter. Abigail stood. "You're safe here, Grace. For now." Grace closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Safe. When the first full light of day washed through that window, she didn't look away. She was awake, alive, ready. She'd survived the darkness. Now dawn demanded what came next. The warning came at dusk. A raven's harsh cry circled overhead, followed by the distant drumbeat of hooves approaching through the brush. Grace was outside, showing the babies a sunlit patch of earth where a new grass had pushed through the spring frost. Abigail stood on the porch, adjusting the sling on her rifle. They didn't exchange looks. They both knew. The storm had found them. Grace scooped the twins and rushed inside, laying them in their basket near the hearth. Then she took her rifle, Eli's rifle, and stepped back onto the porch. Her heart didn't race this time. Her palms didn't sweat. She stood tall. The riders appeared on the edge of the clearing. Cole Burnside, sallow and bent but still burning like a dying coal, led 3 others with him. They stopped 10 feet from the cabin, where the land sloped upward. Grace stepped forward. Abigail did the same, rifle raised at her hip, her face a mask carved from grief and grit. "You're a hard woman to chase down," Cole said, voice low. His smile was cold. "But I got business to finish." Grace tilted her head, gaze flat as a stone. "Your business lies buried in the graves you made. You don't get these children." Cole scoffed, but his eyes darted, not at her, but toward the tree line. Grace heard it before he did. Soft, deliberate steps in dry brush, like the land itself was waking up. Then they appeared. 6 figures from the pines on either side. Men and women from the nearby tribal village, rifles and bows drawn, faces set with old resolve. Chief Hawthorne stepped forward, his voice low, steady as ancient soil. "You bring death to our borders, and we answer, leave." Cole spit in the dirt. "I don't give a damn about your land." "That is your mistake," Hawthorne replied, raising his bow. Grace lifted her rifle. A crack tore through the clearing. A warning shot fired into the empty space beside Cole's boot. Abigail's finger hadn't wavered. "I told you once," she said, voice steady. "Don't make me let her finish what she started." For a breath, it was like time held itself in question. Then Cole turned to face Grace fully, rage etched into every line. "You think you can steal my kids and just call it justice?" Grace's voice was clear as a bell. "I didn't steal anything. I saved what you abandoned." He drew. She fired. The bullet hit his hat and sent it spinning into the dirt. He froze, eyes wide. The look on his face was something like reverence and fear. A second shot cracked the sky, but this time it wasn't Grace. It was Hawthorne. The arrow lodged in the ground inches from Cole's saddle. Cole breathed hard, rage sputtering like a flame losing oxygen. Then he pulled back on the reins, face twisting. "This ain't over." Grace didn't lower her rifle. "It is. If you want to live." He turned. One by one, the men beside him followed. No guns fired, no war cried. They retreated, beaten by women, wind, and something older than any of them. When they were gone, Grace let her breath go. The tribal elders nodded once more before disappearing back into the woods. There were no words exchanged, only respect. Abigail touched Grace's arm, eyes soft with something like pride. "You did it," she murmured. Grace's voice cracked. "We did." That night, under a blanket of first stars, Grace sat beside the fire with Gabriel and Mercy in her lap. She rocked them gently as she sang, a lullaby her mother had once hummed over cornfields at dusk. Her voice quivered but did not falter. The night. The twins slept with tiny fingers curled around her blouse, their breaths in rhythm with her own. She looked up at the stars, at the stretch of land that held death and redemption in the same breath, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me back my heartbeat." Somewhere, just beyond the pines, an owl called. The fire crackled, and for the first time in too long, Grace felt it. Not just safety, belonging. This was one of many true Western stories. If it stirred your heart, saddle up with us for the next ride.